This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace. Whenever I demonstrate taking a photograph on this channel, I'm almost always in full manual mode because that's the mode I choose to use every day. And invariably, somewhere in the comments, someone will ask me, yes, but what metering mode are you using? In fact, I recently had a guy on the channel arguing backwards and forwards with me for days, convinced that the metering mode in his camera affected the exposure even when in manual mode. I think questions like this demonstrate that there's probably a misunderstanding out there amongst a lot of people about what metering in your camera actually is, what it's doing, and how it's helping you get to the exposure that you want to get to. So in this video, I want to lay it out for you what metering is, what the different modes are that you can choose, and how you can give the metering information so it can get to the exposure that you actually intend in your shot. And that I hope that the beginners amongst you will find this information helpful and you'll actually be able to get the results you want in your images more often. So most of you will know that there is actually a little light meter built into almost every camera you can buy these days, just like the little light meters we use in studios that read how much light is coming in. But what's it actually doing? How is it helping us get to a good exposure? We can simplify it down like this. When you take your camera and you point it at any given scene, the light meter sits behind the lens and it measures the amount of reflected light coming in off that scene through the lens. And what it's trying to do is it's trying to make sure that that light is exposed right down the middle at 18% gray or mid-gray. It doesn't want it to be too dark because you won't be able to rescue those details. It doesn't want it in digital terms to be too white or bright because it's going to blow out those pixels and you'll lose the detail. So to play it safe, it's always trying to put your exposure as far as possible right down the middle, 18% gray. Now, it's not doing that in terms of colors. We need to ignore colors. Just think about everything in terms of black and white. It's only looking at brightness to darkness. And it thinks in its brain, if I put that exposure right in the middle, I will rescue as many tones as possible. So nothing's getting too bright and nothing's going too dark, and I keep the whole tonal range. When most people think of the metering in the camera, they think of those little numbers at the bottom of the screen when you look through the viewfinder. -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, and 3. And what the camera is doing when it shows you that little triangle or that little arrow next to one of those numbers, if it's -1, it's saying that your exposure is slightly under. It wants you to brighten up the shot a little bit to get to 0. If it's +2, it's saying it's 2 stops over. We need to bring it down a bit, so we need to change our settings to get back to 0, to get back to that overall 18% gray safe zone where we're not losing highlights or shadows. In the early days of film, when we had simpler cameras, that meter at the bottom, all it was doing is saying to you, I think your exposure should be brighter or darker. And it was your job to input those settings manually by changing your shutter speed or your aperture. You couldn't change your ISO because that was just the ASA of your film, that was fixed. But you would change your aperture and your shutter speed to try and darken or brighten based on those little numbers along the bottom. If it was +1, you need to take it back a stop. So we needed to close down our aperture or speed up our shutter speed just a little bit to get that exposure down the middle. But cameras these days are far more intelligent, and what the light meter can actually do in your camera is to take over the exposure for you and to choose where it thinks the light should be. If you're using any kind of automatic mode in the camera, you're probably taking control of one of the settings, or maybe you're handing them over to the camera completely, but while you're controlling the little thing that you're controlling, it's controlling the other settings to balance out the exposure and put it down the middle where it thinks it should be. So what are these automatic modes where we're letting the camera choose the exposure for us? Well, it's basically any mode in your camera that isn't full manual mode. So for example, if I'm shooting in aperture priority mode, I'm taking control of my aperture, but I'm handing over control of my shutter speed to the camera, and maybe shutter speed and ISO if I've got my camera set to auto ISO. So while I control my aperture, I'm letting the camera decide what my exposure should be with those other two settings. If I'm in shutter priority mode, I'm taking control of the shutter speed on the camera, but I'm allowing the camera to decide where it thinks the aperture should be. And if I'm in auto ISO mode, where the ISO should be as well. The camera is actually choosing what it thinks the exposure should be with the light meter. And here's where I think some people get tripped up, because if I'm shooting a manual mode on my camera, but my ISO is still set to auto ISO, I'm still in an automatic mode. Because whilst I'm taking control of my aperture and my shutter speed, the camera is deciding what my ISO should be. The metering is looking at the scene and it's choosing what the final exposure should be by raising or lowering the ISO. And then obviously if you're shooting in full auto, the camera is deciding all three. It's taking control of your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. It's balancing them out together based on what it thinks the exposure of the scene should be. But when I'm shooting in full manual mode, no auto ISO, and I'm selecting my own aperture, I'm choosing my own shutter speed, I'm deciding what my ISO should be, the camera's metering has absolutely no control. It has nothing to play with because I've made every single decision. So the metering in the camera is still on, but it has absolutely no effect on your final exposure. That little light meter in your camera will probably have an opinion about what it thinks your exposure should be, and it'll let you know. If you look at the numbers along the bottom, it might say, I think you're a bit over or a bit under, but it's your responsibility to take that seriously or not, and to dial in the settings the way you want them to be. It cannot control anything. So it can see, but it can't affect the exposure. You're in charge. As I've said to you on this channel before, when I'm shooting in full manual mode, I prefer to judge my exposure based on either the live preview on the back of the screen on the camera, because I know how to read it at this point, I know the camera quite well, or I use the histogram, because both of those methods give me far more information about what the overall exposure of my image is looking like, where the highlights are, where the shadows are, and what the balance of the two is, than just that one number along the bottom of the screen, which really doesn't give you that much information at all. And that's why when I'm shooting in manual mode, it doesn't matter to me at all what the metering mode in my camera actually is. In fact, I never know what the metering mode is set to on my camera because I never actually use it in the way the camera intends. It's brilliant for automatic modes. It's not that much help to me when I'm shooting in manual. But many of you will shoot in automatic modes of some variation. So let's go through some of these modes and let's take a look at what it's actually doing in your camera. Okay, so if you're shooting in any of those automatic modes, auto or shutter priority or aperture priority or just auto ISO, the metering will be choosing the exposure for you. And there are two ways that you can give that metering information to let it know how you want it to meter the scene. Because if you leave it to your own devices, it's basically a dice roll. So how do you give it that information? And there are two tools that you're going to use. One is by selecting the correct metering mode, and the other is using your exposure compensation dial. And with those two things, you're going to let the camera know what you think is important to you in the scene. Okay, so let's start by selecting a metering mode. And the metering modes that I'm going to use here are from my Sony camera, but every camera brand has very similar metering modes and the principles are very similar. So you'll easily be able to find something comparable in your camera. And the dumbest metering mode I have on my Sony camera is average screen or screen average. Basically what it does is it takes in the whole scene you're looking at, it blurs everything out, works out what the median value is for the whole thing and how close that is to that 18% mid gray or that down the middle gray that we were talking about, that mid-tonal value. And it's going to either brighten it or darken it to get it as close to that middle gray as possible. But it might do this and you might say, well, actually that image is a bit dark. Then you would dial your exposure compensation and say, I want +1, I want one more stop of light than that. So now you've told it, use the average of the screen, but also put an extra stop of light in because what you're coming out with is a bit dark. The next mode is multi, and this is probably the most intelligent mode that we have on our camera when it comes to metering. And I'll be honest, I don't totally understand what it's doing, but basically it's splitting your image into sections and it's trying to work out in those sections, in those blocks, what needs to be brighter or darker in that scene. And with AI, this is becoming more and more intelligent because it's now learning to recognize objects in the scene and what's more important, what it thinks is more important. So it might say that people are more important than backgrounds, and it knows how to recognize the difference between the two. I would recommend, if you're just starting out, use multi-metering or whatever the equivalent is in your camera, because it will do a lot of the thinking for you while you're getting to grips with your camera. But again, you might look at this multi-metering, you might be shooting and saying, well, actually, this scene's a bit too bright. So you might dial your exposure compensation, -1 or -2. You're telling it, use this mode, but actually I want 2 stops less light in this case because I think you're overexposing the shot from the way that I want it to appear. The next mode is center weighted metering. And what this is doing is it's taking the center of your image and it's saying that that's the most important part of the scene that I want you to focus on. I want you to take in the whole scene. It's still looking at the whole image, but you're telling it, I want you to pay special attention, give more weight to what's happening in the center of that shot. And it's going to work out your exposure based on exposing the center of your image correctly, even if it lets some of the outside of the scene go. And again, if it's coming out correctly, you're going to leave your exposure dial to 0. But if you want it a bit brighter, you're going to dial it up a bit, or maybe a lot, or you're going to dial it down if it's too bright. So you're selecting your metering mode and then dialing your exposure compensation dial to say, yes, that's correct, or no, I want a bit more or a bit less light. The next metering mode is spot metering. And this is if you want to be super specific about where you want the camera to focus. You're telling the meter in the camera, I want you to look at this particular spot in the shot and expose that correctly. I don't want you to care about the rest. So you might see a little stripe of light on a wall, but the rest of the scene is very dark in comparison. You put that spot on that little piece of light. You're telling the camera, ignore the shadows, let them go. I want you to expose that little tiny piece of the image properly. And lots of cameras will let you make that spot bigger or smaller, and they'll always let you move them around the screen. It doesn't have to be in the center. So you can say that little thing in the shot, pay attention to that, just expose that correctly. And if it is, leave it to 0. If you want a bit more light, you can start to dial up your exposure compensation dial or dial it down. So by choosing your mode and your exposure compensation dial, you're telling the camera what's important and you're correcting with that compensation dial as you go. And then the last mode, which a lot of you will find very interesting, and I think is a really interesting one, is called highlight weighted metering. And this is a newer one that's come into cameras, and it's not trying to get to that 18% gray anymore. It's just trying to make sure that the highlights in your scene, the brightest parts of the image in your scene, are exposed so that they don't blow out, and the rest of the scene will go dark. So you will have seen me take images in scenes where there's a high contrast ratio and I'm protecting my highlights and embracing the shadows that are created as a result. If you want to shoot in an automatic mode and get those results, highlight weighted metering mode, because it's going to look for the brightest parts of your image and it's going to expose those so that they aren't blown out, and it's going to let the shadows fall dark. Now again, you can be using your exposure compensation dial. You're choosing your highlight weighted metering. Maybe for you it's making the scene slightly too dark and you want to just dial that up 1 stop or 2 stop just to compensate for what it's actually choosing to do if it's not quite where you want it to be. So I hope you can see that with the combination of the metering mode that you use and then the exposure compensation dial and how you actually use this, you're selecting your mode and then changing it on the fly to control how much light you want in or out on that scene based on the metering mode that you've chosen. Okay, so we've just popped out here to this scene that's just around the corner from me, this beautiful old church, and it's quite a contrasty scene. And what I've done is I've set up so that my screen on my camera is going to show you the live preview of the exposure that the camera is going to capture. And we're going to cycle through each one of those metering modes to show you what the camera is actually doing with the light in this scene. So let's start with that first one, which on my camera is just called entire screen average, which is just taking an average of the whole scene and trying to sort of place that down the middle. That's what the camera thinks I should be exposed at. And again, I've still got the option to dial it up with my exposure compensation dial or take it down. If I want to protect some of those highlights, I can control that. But again, that mode's not a super intelligent mode. Let's change it on here to the multi-metering mode, which is a quite intelligent mode. It's splitting that image up into different sections and working out what it thinks the overall exposure should be, but taking into account the different parts of the frame. Again, not a bad exposure, but if I want to change that, I can dial it up 1 stop, 2 stops, or take it down, just using this exposure compensation dial to get that exposure to where I want it to be. Let's try my center weighted. Now you can see here that the exposure is actually more set for where the center of the image is in that shadow. And if I move this around a little bit, you can see it's going to dial it down because now the center of the image is actually on the bright side of that church. So it thinks that's too bright, it's bringing the overall exposure down. If I put the center back onto that shadow side, it's going to lift it again. It is taking into account the whole exposure of the scene, but it's especially focusing on whatever is in the center of that frame. Now, if we change our metering mode here to spot metering, this is where we can be far more specific. It's really just going to focus on that square in the center. So you can see it's brightened it up a lot, being on the shadow side of that church. If I slide it over to where that bright side of the church is with the sun hitting it, it's going to darken it right down. It's really trying to expose for 18% gray on wherever that square is. If I put it over to the sky there, you can see it's really going to bring the exposure down again. So it's focusing only on where that square is. And the nice thing about this mode is I can actually move this square around without changing the composition of the shot. If I want the foreground lit up because I want to see the graves, I can do that. If I want this side of the church done, I can do that. If I can bring it over here to the highlights, I can do that. Sky, making sure the sky is exposed correctly. But remember, it's going to be trying to put that exposure at that 80% gray. Remember, whatever this shows you, you've still got your exposure compensation dial. So you might be getting close, but not quite where you want to be. You can fine tune that exposure with your exposure compensation dial. And then the last mode that we mentioned is our highlight weighted metering. Now, it doesn't matter where the square is in the middle, it's just going to be looking at the brightest parts of the frame, which in this case is the sky and is that side of the church. It's going to be saying, I don't want to blow those highlights out, so I'm going to bring the overall exposure down. So wherever I put this now, I can move this around. It's only going to pay attention to those highlights, making sure that they're not blown out in the scene. And then just to demonstrate, if I place my camera now in manual mode, right, and I'm going to dial in my settings. Let's say I put my shutter speed at 500th of a second, 1000th of a second maybe, and I'm on f4 on my lens, ISO 200. It doesn't matter where I put this now, the actual exposure of the image won't change, and it doesn't matter what mode I put on. The exposure will not change because I've dialed in my exposure for myself. So my metering modes now don't have any effect on what the actual exposure could be or will be, because I've decided that by putting in the settings myself. The only way to change exposure, even the exposure compensation dial, doesn't do anything in manual mode. It's not functioning. I dial my exposure in by changing my aperture, by changing my shutter speed, or by changing my ISO. That's my job to do. The metering modes in the camera don't affect the exposure at all in manual mode. So I hope you found this video helpful, especially those of you who are just starting out, that you're beginning to understand what your camera is actually doing and how it's thinking, and how you can feed it that little bit more information and be more specific so that the exposure you get at the end of the day is the one that you intend. And let me say that I might choose to use full manual mode, but you absolutely don't have to do that. Any of the other modes, shutter priority, aperture priority, full auto if you want, they are all valid choices. It's the shots that you get at the end of the day that counts, not how you get there. So find the one that you're most comfortable with and use it and get the images that you love. Some of my favorite photographers shoot on full auto, and there is nothing wrong with that. But if you do decide to use one of those automatic modes and you're collaborating with your camera, you're letting the camera decide on your final exposure, then hopefully now you understand what your metering is actually doing and how by selecting the correct metering mode for the way that you shoot and using that compensation dial on your camera, that you can get to the exposure you intend in your final shot. Best of luck. Just before I go, I wanted to let you know that the 5th volume of my Parable magazine is out now. It features a lot of the more contrasty, shadowy images that I've made over the years. It's called Shadow Work. And in the magazine, I talk about how I shoot like this, why I like this kind of graphical way of shooting. And I also end by the end talking about the shadows that we pass through in our life, and also the shadow that lurks within each of us, and some of the psychology that goes into making friends with that shadow. These magazines are called Parable for a reason. I'll often start with some photographic idea, but then use that to hopefully illustrate a deeper truth about ourselves. So if you want to pick up a copy of this, either physically like this, or I have a digital version where it's a PDF and an MP3 of me reading the magazine to you, you can go and grab your copies. I will leave a link down below. And then just to mention that we have our annual retreat coming up in July. It will be from the 5th to the 12th of July. I will leave a link down below as well so you can go along and check it out. Spaces are very limited. And just to say, this is not a photography workshop at all. So no matter what level you're at, just come. It's for a week. We go into a beautiful location in the hills of Tuscany just to take a step out of daily life and to calm down, quieten down, and to start to hear some inspiration again. And I've just found that it's a beautiful time to make new creative friends, to share work with each other, to share our stories with each other, and hopefully come back home with a lot more to give and a lot more energy for the work that we make. And then lastly, thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. If you need a website or a domain, they're a fantastic option. I've used them myself as my website of choice for over a decade now. One of the great things about Squarespace for me was how easy it was to set up an online store, because a lot of us as photographers want to share our work, whether it's prints or books or magazines, and personally I was quite intimidated about how that would work. But setting up my store with Squarespace took no time at all. I just integrated it with my Stripe account so payments came through really easily, and then I could load up pictures of my products, write descriptions, set prices, set shipping, and then when the orders started to come in, I could see where they needed to be shipped to. When I posted them off, Customers would receive an automated email letting them know that the item was on the way and even including any tracking information. It couldn't have been simpler. Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.